Thank you for having me. It's been kind of challenging trying to think given the time constraints. Like I teach an entire course on this topic and how to fit it in sort of 35-ish minutes, but I'll try to do my best. So what I thought I'll do today, let's see if I can click through this. Okay, here. So I was hoping to kind of cover four things today broadly. I want to start with a very short theoretical point, and it is covered to some extent in the Barrington reading, if you had a chance to look about it. It's basically alternative kind of conceptual and theoretical approaches to studying identity and nationalism in post-Soviet Eurasia, or former Soviet Union, and in general. And then I'm going to talk about very briefly what was the policy towards nationalities during the Soviet period and what consequences it produced. And so specifically focusing on this tension between policy of nativization and Russification that the Soviet state pursued pretty much through its existence. And then it left consequences for the post-Soviet identities in these countries. So the second half of my talk, I'm going to talk about this nationalizing state paradigm and distinction between civic and ethnic nationalism, both introducing them and to some extent questioning how useful they actually are as far as explaining this nation building and identity developments in the post-Soviet region. And then finally, whatever time we have left, hopefully at least a few minutes, I just want to introduce some illustrative evidence from Ukraine to kind of put some empirical meat on these, rather more abstract points I'm going to be making through my presentation. And so without further ado, let me start with this guy who, in fact, is a very good introduction to what scholars would call a primordialist view on the states and nations. So Putin, in his war against Ukraine, justifies it to a substantial extent by arguing that Ukrainians are really Russians. And that is not sort of a hypothesis that he has in mind. It's basically a statement of fact. So there is such a thing as objectively existing nations, and there is no such a thing as objectively existing Ukrainian nation, because Ukrainians are really Russians, and that's how it has been since time immemorial, as he says. And that's basically, he's now trying to correct this historical wrong, because if there is no nation, there shouldn't be sort of distinct sovereign Ukrainian state that could also, do anything that Russia doesn't like. So that's sort of aberration on the natural order of things. And this, taking Putin aside, this conception that there is such a thing, there are such things as historically determined nations that exist, quote unquote, from time immemorial, that basically the ethnocultural communities that today we call nations have formed at the dawn of time. And these identities then persist through millennia, essentially not with much change. And then sort of at a later time in the modern period, at the age of nationalism, these national groups awaken, begin to demand political autonomy, and then later sort of states form. So this kind of sequence of events is from objectively existing ethnocultural nations that, whose origins can be traced back to the dawn of time, and then nationalism as an ideology or political movement and nation states come later. And this is very common kind of way of thinking about the world of nation states. This is probably familiar to most of you, some version of it, maybe to less extent in America, but certainly in many European countries. That's how history is taught, that, our people have existed and struggled through time for liberation, so forth. But there are substantial problems with this approach. Most importantly, as historians would point out, and I know some of you are historians or have degrees in history, but that's actually not the case. If you start looking back in time and try to sort of think and look into how really people identified themselves 300, 400, 500 years ago, we find that these identities that exist today were something different or may not even existed at all in the previous, some time ago. And to say now, from our vantage point, that yes, there was Russian nation, Ukrainian nation, French nation, whatever other nation, is what scholars would call retrospective nationalism. In other words, we are ascribing to people in the past identities that they themselves did not have. And when I sort of teach about it in my classes, I invite my students to imagine this thought experiment. If, say, they were, transferred back in time, and ended up, I don't know, like in anywhere in Europe, let's say, like in France, some 500 years ago, and they met some person on the street, like in the, some peasant, and they would say, like, hey, you peasant, you're French, and the king in the palace is French, and your landlord is French, and so is the priest, and you are all equal as members of the French nation. Like, that would make no sense to that person. That would be like just not how the world works. This is not how people thought about it. They thought about themselves maybe in religious terms, maybe in local terms, maybe in class terms, but this sort of phenomena of mass nation as imagined community, that you belong to the same collectivity with people you never met, including rich people, poor people, people from all social classes, and you together constitute a nation. This is a very, very modern way of thinking about oneself, the world, and sort of the world around us. And this is where this constructivist paradigm comes in, which I think is much more useful. And in fact, pretty much all scholars of nationalism today are more in the constructivist as opposed to primordial school. But so the father of constructivism, sometimes constructivism is also called modernism, is this scholar Ernst Gellner, who was of Czech origin, if I remember correctly. And he sort of famously says that the world as we know it was created about around the end of 18th century, and nothing before that makes the slightest difference to the issue we face. Meaning what he's saying, and this is sort of, if I unpack a little bit the constructivist claim, is that it's a complete kind of opposite take from primordialism, that it basically says ethnic and national identities is not something that is given and existed through history. It is a form of identity that is constructed, and it is constructed under the influence of various social, political, and institutional contexts, and specifically the development of modern states. So essentially, the constructivists are arguing that modern nations emerge as a byproduct almost of modern states. So once political authority was established over a certain territory and sort of the institution of a state emerged, then the rulers of the state become kind of interested in having a nation to support it. Why that is the case? Because, for example, if we think of mass conscription, if people can be, instead of hired in the mercenary armies and being paid to fight for a particular landlord, they believe that they're fighting for the nation. That's kind of a useful way to mobilize military. If we think of economic development, when people come from all different parts of the state and they have to work in these factories in the age of modernization, industrialization, this is also helpful for these people to speak the same language, it's the interchangeable workforce over this territory of the state. So then we get to the standardization of language, mass elementary schooling and secondary schooling, teaching people history, this kind of primordial history. So they begin to think of themselves and the nation they're more likely to fight. So all of, to fight for the state. So basically all of this, sort of the argument here is that the emergence of modern states and the economic and industrial progress associated with it, which happens around the 18th century, this is why Gellner says nothing that happens before really matters, what then enables the creation of these ethnic people who think of themselves, as belonging to these mass nations, formation of these national identities. Now, once this process kind of completes itself, then these identities may become more sticky, although constructivists still allow for some possibility of change. So it's not sort of, so this, height of nation formation is this period of industrialization, urbanization, formation of modern states, but there is still some possibility for change after that, and I'll talk about, hopefully time a little bit left to say how this change has been going on in Ukraine over the last 15 or so years, and more broadly from the Soviet period. So one way to think of this difference between primordialism and constructivism, I can't remember, this is not my invention, but I thought it was very apt analogy between the Sleeping Beauty, so-called in The Bride of Frankenstein, right? And this notion of Sleeping Beauty, that there are these nations, that nations are sort of always there, but they've been asleep, and then they awaken in this age of nationalism, and they begin to make demands, and then, modern states arises. And constructivism is completely the opposite. It starts the story from the states. So in other words, not nations precede states, but states precede nations. Then states develop this ideology of nationalism, these policies of national homogenization through mass education, literacy, print press, conscription, and then the nations arise. So it is very different kind of way of thinking about these processes. Now, so I already said that, but just to summarize, kind of completely different sort of, what comes first, nations or states. For primordialists, nations come first, then nationalism, then states, and for constructivists, it's the other way around. States come first, then they develop ideology of nationalism, and then mass nations emerge as a result of propagation of this ideology. Now, sort of switching back to the region that we're talking about. So how does this all relate to the former Soviet Union, especially at the time it arises when Russian Empire collapses at the end of the First World War? The Bolsheviks really face a dilemma. So if we think of Bolshevik ideology, Marxist essentially ideology, what was the end goal? And that was the goal of the Bolshevik leaders who took over Russian Empire following the fall of provisional government, is that the end result is going to be this stateless, classless society and worldwide communism. So Bolsheviks believed that over time, national differences will disappear altogether. I'm not going to go into sort of the nitty-gritty details of communist ideology, but the basic notion was that class exploitation was the cause of all ills. Once you remove class exploitation, there won't be sort of a need for the state that enforce oppression of the classes, and eventually there won't be a need for the nations either, because this is like false consciousness that the capitalists are trying to impose on the population, and there will be basically classless, stateless worldwide society. Now, the question is, how do you get there, given the realities that you face? And realities the Bolsheviks face in 1917, during the period of the civil war that follows their takeover of power, is substantial national mobilization in the non-Russian regions against Bolshevik rule, and especially in Ukraine. So Ukraine was not the only area where Bolsheviks had to fight nationalists, essentially, or people who were mobilizing for the Ukrainian National Republic. There were all these disagreements, sort of with what relations it will have with Russia, but there was basically this nationalist mobilization on the Russian periphery, because that was the time of formation of mass nationalism, kind of Gilnerian constructivist view. Right now, so they have to sort of figure out, what do you do with this nationalist mobilization? So yes, they win the civil war, and then there is a debate among Bolshevik leaders: do you suppress these all manifestations of nationalism, because this is basically goes against the end goal of this classless, stateless, nationless, communist society, or because this is kind of too dangerous, you don't really have the capacity to do it, you have to somehow harness or allow but control this nationalist expression. So there is this lively debate among Bolshevik leaders in the like around 1920, 1918, 1919. Eventually, the ones the side that argues for allowing but harnessing national sentiment wins. Lenin is a proponent of this, and this policy known as nativization, or if you use the Russian word korenizatsiya, it comes from the word koren, which means root. So it's like the policy of rootedness is adopted. The nativization peaks in 1920s under Lenin, and essentially what nativization does, and a colleague of mine from the Davis Center, Terry Martin, who's a historian and who'd written, I think it's like 800 book about Bolshevik nationality policies, specifically focusing on this period, used this very neat term, affirmative action empire, to describe what the Bolsheviks decided to do. So they essentially decided to allow minority cultural groups a form of nationhood, in order to kind of have a buy-in from them to the overall communist project of keeping unified state and ultimately building communism. But you have to sort of bring the communist ideas, the way their thinking was going at the time, in the language that these minority groups understand. You have to get local elites to promote these kinds of ideas. And then you also have to give this national non-Russian ethnic groups sort of a form of nationhood, so they would have the borders, the institutions, the creation of these republics in the Soviet Union. But ultimately, any kind of wrong nationalism that would go against centralized rule, that would go against Soviet Union, that could be considered bourgeois nationalism, would be very ruthlessly suppressed. And that's kind of was the essence of this nativization policy that peaks in the 1920s. Then after Lenin dies, Stalin really scales it down, but they never fully abandon it. And then for the remainder of the Soviet period, before I get to that, let me just sort of illustrate what it meant. The concept was that this policy would be national in form, but socialist in content. And that's kind of the illustration of what it was. This is a poster from early 1920s. Here is this very kind of culturally Ukrainian art, we can say. So there is this typical haircut, embroidered shirt, all of this, but the message is very communist. So here is this old man is encouraging his son to join the school of the Red Commanders to defend Soviet Ukraine, right? So that's kind of exact manifestation of national in form, but socialist in context. So the messaging has to be what the Soviet state allows, but the kind of the container in which it's packaged, the way it's expressed, is this, national cultural manifestations. So the Soviet Union then gets organized into these ethnic republics. So each of these 15 Union republics, and there was sort of matryoshka nationalism, because some of these republics, including Russia, were further arranged into autonomous regions, autonomous republics, and all the way down to the village level in the Lenin period. But ultimately, once it gets scaled down, these sort of village level ethnic formations are eliminated, but the Union one are maintained. So we have these 15 Union republics. Each one is a titular republic for particular ethnic groups. So Ukrainian Republic, Kazakh Republic, and so forth. Russians had a peculiar situation there. I'm going to sort of not go into detail now, but certainly happy to talk about Q&A, sort of what role that ethnic Russians played in this affirmative action empire. Now, official ideology then would be for the remainder of the Soviet period that there was no nationality problem in the Soviet Union, that Soviet Union solved nationality problem, and instead what existed was friendship of the people. That was the Soviet terminology, Druzhba Narodov. I very much remember it from my old Soviet schooling that we had this Druzhba Narodov, and we were on the way to build communist society and so forth. Now, if you look at this kind of hierarchy here, so this is, I'm going to get to the topic of inconsistency and especially this oscillation between nativization and Russification. Who is the forefront here? The person, I don't know if I can get my here, right? So at the front here, we have the most important republics. Yes, there's French of the people, but some Turkmens are all the way in the back. Here's Russian, here's Ukrainian, right? So the sort of, again, Russian boy, and there are many other imagery we can see. Sort of the Russians are meant to be playing particularly important role, kind of the older brother, guiding all the other friends towards communism. And this is where this policy of inconsistency and Russification comes in. So as I said, after 1930, Soviet state scales down nativization, but never fully abandons it. But what begins to kind of get more and more attention is this policy that scholars subsequently called Russification, because it was promotion of Russian, especially language in education, also in public life, at the expense of minority culture. So we have sort of more and more schooling being in Russian as opposed to in the native languages in the republics, the parental choice, so to say. And again, the incentives were for the parents, because Russian was considered the language of progress, of communism, of career advancement. There were these various policies. You could, yes, maybe send your child to elementary school to study in Kyrgyz, but you can't defend, say, a doctoral dissertation in Kyrgyz, and you can only use Kyrgyz in the Kyrgyz Republic, and even there, kind of less and less so. So essentially, this sort of inconsistency between, on the one hand, still maintaining nativization elements, as in like ethnic identity was recorded in the passport. There was some native language schooling. There is something in the chat, but I don't know if I'm meant to read it. Oh, somebody said, okay. Sandra, I'm just to let you know, I'm not going to read the chat now, but if there is something you need to let me know, just speak up, okay? Because I just can't quite.
No worries.
Yeah, okay. So, right, so then when we think about what were the consequences of this policy by the late Soviet period, so we have on the one hand these quasi-states with attributes of statehood. So there are these 15 union republics, each one has its borders, they're kind of meaningless, but they exist. Each one has a parliament, it has national press, it has academy of culture, it has cultural intelligentsia, it has these native elites who can speak for the nation, right? And on the other hand, the populations have quite mixed, oftentimes, and fluid identities. There was a lot of immigration, intermarriage. These republics had large minority populations, so it's not the case that, like, 90 or 99% of the Kyrgyz population was ethnically Kyrgyz. There was sort of this, and people, some sort of themselves more maybe in the titular nation terms, some sort of themselves more in sort of Soviet terms. Soviet was not a distinct nationality, but for many people, sort of these exclusive identities were not part of their daily life. And there were grievances. Again, not everybody shared these grievances equally, but certainly the cultural elite in many of these republics did, over Russification in particular. And then all of these grievances come out in the open once Gorbachev starts his perestroika and glasnost reforms. And then the populations kind of begin to make these choices. And again, I don't have time to go into it in great detail, but given these sort of blurred multiple identities, some people, made, and some did, decide to kind of maybe support Gorbachev's project of keeping the Soviet Union together. But many others who before perestroika were in no way nationalist, now kind of with this new political environment, decide that they want to support the cause of national liberation, whichever way they understood it, right? And the Soviet Union was, yes, it was arranged in these 15 republics, territorially speaking, but it was a very multinational state. And there was no, again, if we go back to Ernst Gellner's term, so-called congruence between political and national units, meaning that if you look at each of these post-Soviet republics, there was substantial diversity in there, meaning that this is, for example, last Soviet census, this relative size of the titular group, right, eponymous group to the name of the republic, Ukrainians in Ukraine, Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, so forth, we see great variation there. And with the exception of Armenia, not much homogeneity, meaning that, again, sort of the political unit, which became states, all of these countries when Soviet Union collapses, does not really match to the national unit, because sort of the national composition and the identities in these republics are not exclusive and much more complex. So we have, again, this phenomena where many people who ended up outside the borders of their designated ethnic homeland when the Soviet Union collapses, especially 25 plus million ethnic Russians who end up living outside of the Russian Republic once it becomes an independent state, millions of Ukrainians and all others. So basically this incongruence between political and national unit then kind of presents a challenge to the governments in these post-Soviet states who begin to engage in nation building. Again, in the sort of theoretical conception of nation state, the nation and the state supposed to be congruent, like that's sort of the normal quote unquote way to think of a nation state. So here is a political unit and people who live within the state, they're both citizens, so they have political rights, and they also think of themselves as one nation. But that was not necessarily the case in most of these post-Soviet countries, right? So then sort of the states begin to engage in what some scholars have called nationalizing policies, calling the states nationalizing states, but they would be promoting, for example, language of the titular group to undo consequences of Russification, culture, certain reading of history that again goes against the Soviet narrative of friendship of the people, how everybody always wanted to be together and with Russian leadership, so forth. They're now beginning to kind of question, and that's especially what's happening, give a lot of grievance to Russians, how this process was unfolding in Ukraine, right? But here is sort of, something that I just wanted to put in as a question. If there is time, certainly we can talk about it, right? And this is now has become a more recent criticism of this nationalizing states paradigm, that implicit in this designation, that nationalizing state is something bad, right? Like this is something illiberal, this is something problematic, right? And especially because, say, if you have nationalizing state that is in the name of the titular group, what about minorities? Like, isn't this discriminatory against minorities? Especially, Russian minority was sort of this super minority that enjoyed privileged status in the Soviet period, no longer does in the post-Soviet period. Isn't therefore this a problematic set of policies, right? What scholars who now question this sort of normative negative characterization of nationalizing states would now point out that, like, well, yes, it doesn't mean that sort of any nationalizing policy should be okay, but as a process itself, it actually has a redeeming value because it is basically a push against Soviet-era Russification, and therefore, instead of sort of using this pejorative ethnic nationalism, nationalizing state paradigm, maybe it can be thought of as a form of national liberation or a form of anti-colonialism, and then we can sort of debate how far it is legitimately can be taken, what specific policy may or may not be discriminatory, but the very fact that there is this nationalizing paradigm, nationalizing states, is actually not, not sort of morally problematic that this is going on, again, because it is a form of national liberation and anti-colonialism. Now, related, sort of, we can say, theoretical approach or conceptual approach is to think of, again, if you want to make normative judgment about the kind of nationalizing policies post-Soviet states pursued, is to try to make a distinction between what's known as civic and ethnic nationalism. Again, this is something that was in the Barrington reading for today, so he explains this distinction. He's quite, I think, generally sort of supportive of it. And again, on the face of it, it seems like it's a reasonable distinction. We can say, well, if it's a form of civic nationalism or sort of civic nation, that basically it is using some sort of non-ethnic criteria, such as citizenship, territory, loyalty to state institutions, is more inclusive. By contrast, ethnic nationalism that defines, belonging or defines the nation by some set of ethnocultural criteria, be the ethnicity, language, or religion, or some combination of these, is kind of more exclusive and therefore more discriminatory, and therefore something to kind of be normatively critical about. Now, again, especially in recent years, but not only, these criticisms have been made already in the 1990s, because typology itself was developed in the 1930s by this scholar Hans Kohn. And from the time he talked about it in the interwar period and made this distinction between civic and ethnic nationalism, it had very implicit kind of pro-Western bias, because the good, who were the good civic nations and good civic nationalism, was a feature of Western Europe. And East Europeans were sort of these bad ethnic ones. So that's sort of one kind of problem for it. And then maybe even more fundamentally, it is actually, this distinction is nothing but very clear. Because when you start looking at what exact policies count as civic nationalism, like look at the United States, sometimes it's used as the most quintessential example of civic nationalism, right? But critics would say, well, is it really all that civic? Because, for example, anything from English language being kind of more prominent, from Christmas being a state holiday and not some other state holiday, right? From sort of this Judeo-Christian tradition and so forth. So even, and US is sort of as close as it gets to civic nationalism, one can begin to question, like, is this really all that civic? The same argument can be made about France, another example of civic nationalism, but think of the centrality of the French language and quotas on language and so forth, right? Like, is this really civic? The hijab debate, can you really be French if you also want to cover your head and face? So anyway, so the point here is that, and that's what scholars have pointed out, that maybe such a thing as purely civic state does not exist at all. So this is really a myth, and there is some research arguing exactly that. There's a famous book called The Myth of a Civic State, right? And then again, if we are sort of left with a continuum, just like nationalizing state, the terminology itself, the concept itself potentially become less useful. And what we really need to think about, what specific set of policies, right? No matter if you're going to call them civic or ethnic or nationalizing or what specific set of policies are and they're not problematic, are and they're not discriminatory, what does discrimination versus affirmative action means in the post-Soviet context, and so forth, right? Okay, so let me, how are we doing? I think we're almost out of time, right? Very briefly, I want to just illustrate some of these things that I talked about on the case of Ukraine, and really kind of to make 4 points. The broader point is that identities in Ukraine are much, much more complex than and attitudes towards nationalizing policies as well, than any of these popular dichotomies that you hear in the media, that public commentary that many political actors throw around freely to explain anything from the current war to all sorts of other events in that part of the world. So these simple dichotomies, ethnic Ukrainian versus ethnic Russian, Ukrainian speaker versus Russian speaker, geographic East, geographic West, in reality are much more complicated. What we see instead are these very layered and multiple identities that are not static, that are changing and evolving over time. In Ukraine, 2014 Euromaidan was a particularly important turning point when sort of this identity consolidation process and Ukraine becoming more Ukrainian really accelerates, even though some movement in that direction was happening since the early 1990s. Another point I want to illustrate very briefly with some slides, that the civic and ethnic identity or civic ethnic nationalism is actually not exclusive. These are not two mutually exclusive positions, but can coexist. And we see that in how people define their ethnicity and their most important identity, right? And finally, also I think important point that even though we often think that these ethnic identities or ethnocultural identities are fixed and then they are determining political attitudes. In fact, what we see in Ukraine, and I would say in other post-Soviet states as well, that is actually the opposite could be taking place. In other words, people develop certain political attitudes, in case of Ukraine, attitudes to the war, attitudes to the state, and then they might change their linguistic practices and their conceptions of self as a result of these political attitudes. So I think Kulik reading, if you had a chance to look at it, looks at it quite, in some detail and offers very useful evidence. So just again to kind of, you may be familiar with these maps of two Ukraines. Here are the results of 2004-2010 presidential elections, and kind of they overlap with the extent in particular of the prevalence of Russian language, where people speak Russian or Ukrainian. But then again, once you begin to parcel these sort of easy dichotomies, pictures very quickly become much more complicated. This is again sort of ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine, but now instead of looking at the level of the oblast, these larger administrative units, this looks at the level of a county, and you have sort of quite different now picture, where sort of what is Ukrainian speaking as opposed to Russian speaking part of Ukraine. And even then, when we say Ukrainian speaking versus Russian speaking, what about people who speak both? So in Ukraine, there is this very prevalent kind of blurred identity, especially linguistic practice. People are actively bilingual. They may speak Russian in one context, Ukrainian in the other. Which category are you going to put them in, especially if these categories are binary, and then assumptions are made that people who belong into this category have certain political attitudes, which, becomes much more complicated. The same with the geography, pro-Western, pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian West, pro-Russian, Russian-speaking East. Well, where exactly is the border? In Ukraine, the center, geographic center has been very, very important, and this is where this kind of change in identity begins to occur already in the 1990s. Here, just for illustrative purposes, I put a map where you can see the borders, the regions where pro-Western political parties that advocated sort of more both pro-Western orientation and more sort of nationalizing policy, where they come first on the party list vote. And you see from 1991 through 2004, this border is moving more and more and more to the east, meaning sort of the western half of Ukraine, if you want to talk about it, gets bigger and the kind of Russian one gets smaller. Now, and of course, these processes really accelerate after 2014, the start of Russian aggression, and you can see that in a variety of popular attitudes. Here, for example, attitudes to giving Russian the status of second official language in Ukraine, which used to be supported, by kind of slight majority, plurality, but then after 2014, we have a very different story. This, you can be familiar maybe with those dramatic change in attitudes to EU and NATO, again, following Russian aggression, first in 2014, then in 2022, full-scale invasion. So really change at a very fundamental level, change by region. So this sort of, the situation that we have now, where over 80% in historical Russian-speaking South and East support membership in the EU and NATO, right? This is quite dramatic change, and I don't have time to go into detail, but we now even see linguistic change. So this is the point that political attitudes can drive identities, not the other way around. So people who, in Kulik's reading, he shows that people changed kind of a two-step process, that they changed their attitudes to their identity, but they continue to speak Russian. After 2022, more and more people are actually switching to speaking Ukrainian. Again, political attitudes drive this identity choice. And just sort of last point I want to say, this complementarity of civic and ethnic identities, as you can see here on this slide, the percent of people who self-identify as ethnic Ukrainian, and that number grows. So what happens? Like, it's not that, ethnic Russians all left. It's many people who thought of themselves as ethnic Russians, which was a more prestigious, kind of useful identity in the Soviet period. Over time, they and their descendants, who were born in Ukraine, changed that. And now at this point, we have 95% of the population identified as ethnic Ukrainians, and Russians stand at 2-3%. Where did these old people go? They re-identified as Ukrainian. But at the same time, right, this sort of ethnic identity is complementary and goes hand in hand with increase in civic identity. So here is this, when people are given different identity options, what is your primary identity? How do you think of yourself? Citizen of Ukraine is becoming more and more popular identities. Again, you can see this sort of jumping points in time. Even 2004, the Orange Revolution, we didn't have time to talk about that, but that was also an important turning point in Ukrainian history. And then 2014 Euromaidan, and of course the full-scale invasion of 2022. So that is pretty much all I had to say. So I just wanted to put one quick point, that if your students might be interested in learning more about sort of identities, especially in the context of international relations, Tufts has this pre-college IA program. So I'm going to leave this in the slides. I don't know if Sandra wants to share the slides later with you, but just something that you let your students know. And yes, I'm now happy to answer any questions, and I'm sorry if it's gone on too long.